This is the third edition of the conference on cooperation in Central and Eastern European higher education. It was an initiative coming from Corvinus University. If I'm not wrong, it was Professor Jozsef Berac who first had the idea. He's here, and we at CEU are very proud to have been co-organizing this conference together with our colleagues from Corvinus. As I said, this is the third edition. I hope there are many more to come. The idea was to have a reflection based on research about important aspects in higher education policy, in particular in our part of the world, bring together people who represent perhaps different but complementary horizons or areas such as research, applied research, policy practice, university administration. So this is not just an academic conference where the purpose is to prepare papers for publication, but also try to inform kind of reflection about how things are going, how things can be made better, going through the filter of policy. And every year we publish a volume with papers presented at the conference, and I think these have been very successful publications last year and the previous year. I'm sure it will be the same this year. Actually, this year we have a lot more participants and a lot more papers, both keynote addresses and papers in breakout sessions. So the volume will be probably a lot thicker than this one. And there is interest coming from members of the research community, but also university administration community, if there is anything like that, and the higher education policy work. So it looks like this is useful. I'll stop here, and I think I'm going to invite my colleagues to make their presentations proceeding in strictly geographical order, starting from the right to the left.
Thank you, Liviu. I'd like to stick to what I presented yesterday, and particularly pick up the question that emerged a little bit in the discussions afterwards, whether there's something specific to the Central Eastern European region that makes structural reform in higher education different from other parts of the world. And I'm not sure whether I will be provocative, but let's assume that I'm provocative. I would argue that there is no real difference between parts of the world when it comes to higher education reforms. If you remember, I'll shortly repeat those 5 critical factors that are important for successful higher education reform. We think about consensus among key stakeholders. If we think about adequate funding for reform projects, taking the time for implementation and realizing the results, creating win-win situations, and the last one, do a proper evaluation or even monitoring throughout the whole policy process and evaluate carefully what you have achieved. I think these are universal phenomena that are not necessarily connected to only a Western European model of reform in higher education. I would argue that there are, in that sense, no huge differences between the systems, and that we can stick to the same kind of critical factors. Adding one sentence, if you allow me to, of course there are national idiosyncrasies and they apply to your regions as well. But my point is, they apply to Western systems as well. If you would ask me, if you would ask Harry, if you would ask anybody else, is there something special on the Dutch higher education system? We would all say, yes, there's something special. But that's not my main point. If it's about reform, I would argue that the critical success factors would apply to any part of the world, whether it's Eastern, Western Europe, Africa, Latin America, etc.
Thank you. Lydia?
Well, yes, I mean, Joran talking before me was the perfect opportunity to go back a little bit and maybe point out that some researchers, and I know of a very recent special issue talking about Central and Eastern Europe, called Central and Eastern European countries laboratories of reform. They were in a unique position to sort of absorb all the European and international policy agendas and translate them according to the individual national contexts in very different policy arrangements up to a point. I presented the peculiarity of the Romanian system, but at the same time, as Aaron pointed out, there are some critical factors which are common when it comes to the success of policy change. It is maybe worth noting, and I would make a link here between research of educational policy and actually making and implementing educational policy, is that using research, using what most people in this room are doing, is not a reflex for policymakers. And I wouldn't necessarily call it a regional feature, but I would say policy making in education, or the maturity of policy making in education, is very closely linked with how other policy areas are doing, or how the democratic system is maturing. In other words, we do have data, maybe not as perfect as in other countries. We do have research. It's not always used, and I think it's a two-way street here. I mean, on one hand side, policymakers need to fall back on data in order to justify their decisions. Maybe not in the public discourses always, but in terms of justifying within the layers of government, you do need some data to fall back on. But at the same time, I think if researchers see areas for improvement, they need to make their case better. And I was last night at dinner, I had a wonderful dinner at the academy. We were discussing this issue of the responsibility of the researchers to get their point across. And this type of conference, I think, is a very good opportunity for that. It also enables us to exchange good practice, because as I also mentioned this morning, it seems that Romania is not the only country which switches or tries to switch from very ad hoc policy making, or policy making which is generated by European pressures, to a more long-term sustainable ways of building public policies in higher education. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
I'll continue where I have started earlier, maybe just to highlight three issues that I find particularly relevant for the policies in our region. One has to do with updating the curriculum across, or paying a particular attention to updating the curriculum across the fields, so that the curriculum is more in line with the current demands of the labor market, that the curriculums are not very narrowly specialized. The study programs are not very specialized, but more broadly based. I think I probably speak about this especially from the context of Slovenia, where we have huge amount of very narrowly specialized study programs, which land you with a very narrow definition of qualification and a very specialized profession, and that is simply not the kind of preparation for the labor market and the needs of the knowledge economy of the future. I think that this is one of the areas that needs serious discussion and rethinking. The other one is dealing directly with the excellence in teaching and learning, the discussion on how to create incentives within the higher education institutions and within the higher education systems, incentives for teachers, higher education teachers, to actually experiment and innovate and upgrade their teaching methods. I firmly believe the teachers are well-intended, that they would like to be excellent teachers, that they really want to have a connection for their students, that they want to make an impact on their students, but often do not have the time or the resources to improve themselves. So on one hand, we have to make them aware of where they stand in their teaching, and on the other hand, we have to support them. And the third area is what we have to seriously think about is improving methods of data collection on student experiences on one hand and student learning outcomes on the other hand. Survey research, surveys are widely popular. I'm sure that there's no institution here that does not practice one way or the other, measure student satisfaction or student engagement, or measure student satisfaction with the courses. But there are lots of problems with this particular data, and we have to find better ways to do so. Just to give you one example, what is now very hot in the terms of the data collections, it's digital ethnography. It's trying to take advantage of social media or create applications and social media applications which would give us qualitative insights into student experiences on a potentially large scales. For those, if you are interested in this, I have been involved with a project, or I have developed an app that is trying to do that. It has several weaknesses, but it's one way of trying to make a headway into the new ways of social science research with the usage of social media in order to get better data of what is happening with the students, to better understand student experiences in view of making student experiences better.
Thank you very much, Manja.
I would like to connect these two kind of topics we are discussing now. I mean, this teaching and learning and how to enhance excellence, and on the other hand, the whole governance issue a little bit. So I think most of you started to teach students from Far East. I have some experience with that. And, you know, I just used the similar method I used most Hungarian students, like I ask questions, I try to involve students, I give my best performance what I can. And after the whole session, some students from the Far East came to me and told me that you are the teacher, don't ask us questions. We want to hear what you say because you have the knowledge and we don't have that knowledge. And what is important here is that there needs a kind of culture. And the same situation is true for the universities, and that's where I want to go to the topic of Harry's and the topic of Jeroen, that institutional autonomy is a cornerstone of how institutions work, and that I firmly believe that. But it is not a matter of state; it's a matter of process, how we achieve that kind of thing. And in countries where there is strong state controlled situation, I think there is a kind of learned dependency of institutions. So if I just give them a lot of freedom, they can't really use that, because they will abuse it sometimes, or they simply cannot do what they do. If I give all the freedom to my 80-year-old kids to do what you want, he's going to play Minecraft all the time, and that's not very useful thing. And perhaps there is need to, to orient him somehow. So what I want to say here is that we should overcome this kind of learned dependency. And that is a kind of process we have to manage somehow, and that's not very trivial in Eastern European sections where the trust level is very low toward government and in general in the society, because in that situation the government usually wants to control, but that is the way how he can achieve performance. So I think there is good reason what Harry showed us, that this performance agreement framework developed in that way, that first we have state controlled, then we have state supervised, and then we move back. This performance contract is not simply viable from a direct state control status without going to state supervision, because without going state supervision, institutions simply cannot have that kind of autonomy feeling. They always look for the state to tell what to do, and that's perfect what happens, or that's exactly what happens in Hungary. Institutions usually want the state to tell them what to do, and it is a lot of time. It requires a lot of time so we can learn how to be independent. And if we always just confuse all these regulations and then do another one and another one, then institutions really are confused as well. And the best way to do that is just follow what they want, and they won't be really autonomous.
Thank you, Gary. Attila.
So I'm not going to repeat that the most important is the admission. Since yesterday, I think we all know this. I'm not going to repeat how important is evidence-based policy formation, policy development in times of post-factual developments. I would like to stress 2 points. Listening yesterday's presentation about these centers in Central Europe related to higher education research, I think that we are all foundation or funded driven organizations. My center is 100% third-party funded. Most probably many others struggle also with the funding of higher education research. So I would go for a call to find a proper solution here, maybe a mix of a basic funding and a competitive funding, also to give a kind of a freedom to higher education research of the future. I'm not declaring the need of to become responsible. But I'm saying that if we only run after the money, we may end up in a certain limitation also related to our research. Just recently, we developed a kind of a manifest related to higher education research and higher education management. So the question somehow is, so how to bring research into policy formation, and even more important, how to bring this into practice. And what we did is a kind of a guideline to bring together those two words, higher education research and higher education management, towards, for example, leadership. I'm not going to repeat all this. I'm happy to share this maybe after this conference with you. I would like to stress one point, and this is the importance of institutional research. I think that in our realities as higher education researcher, we have different missions, and one is definitely also to get an impact at institutional level and influence higher education management. But this is not the most important, maybe. To overcome this and to create a bridge, maybe institutional research and the capacities at institutional level might be also a solution here to overcome those challenges of implementation. And therefore, and this is the last sentence, I'm really happy and proud that next year the European Association of Institutional Research is coming to see you. So the annual forum is going to take place here. And if you are familiar with ER, and the mission of the association, this is linking policy, practice, and research.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Higher education studies demonstrate that higher education systems where institutions have a lot of institutional autonomy perform better than those systems where institutions have a very low level of institutional autonomy. So that would be my message to the governments over here on this part of Europe as well as other parts of Europe. I would always try to enhance institutional autonomy, as complicated as the issue may be, if you want to improve the performance of your system, not of every single institution, but of the system. I agree with Gergely that it's very clear that you have to learn how to deal with institutional autonomy. It's not something overnight that when you get that you're able to do it. It takes time to learn. That's how to bear this responsibility. And that's where the challenge is, I would say, because in those countries where institutions have a lot of institutional autonomy, they also play the game and they are very opportunistic in their behavior, not always at the advantage of either a national government or the students. The institutions use their freedom for themselves, and that's not necessarily the same as for students or for the national agendas. So the challenge would be that on the one hand, governments respect and enhance institutional autonomy, and at the same time make sure that they develop rules where this opportunistic behavior is limited to a large extent. And that's a challenge. There's not a perfect answer to that. But I would suggest, at least in some circumstances, and maybe that's provocative to say it here right now in this country, government should not tell institutions what to do. They should tell institutions what to achieve.
Thank you very much. Let me add one thought to this conversation. We are doing beautifully in terms of time, so it will take us less than half hour to cover so much territory all the way from Ghent to Twente. And I spoke very briefly yesterday about what appears to be a phenomenon of a change in the social contract or social compact, and I'm not meaning this in a formal way about universities in this part of the world. And I would like to add to that rather than repeating what I said yesterday. I think what I would like to add is two things. The first thing is that what is very often forgotten is, or we don't even realize in universities, is that what happens in universities and around universities is relevant for much deeper issues. And sometimes universities are like, you remember that old substance when we still had films for negatives for making pictures, and we use a substance which I think in English was called revelator or something like that. Something to reveals to reveals the picture on that. And universities serve as this kind of substance sometimes. And I can mention many examples around the world. A little bit randomly, when students in Myanmar protested many years ago, and then recently 2 years ago, they protested against the restriction to university autonomy. But in reality, it was a lot more than that, and that's why they were arrested, put in jail, some of them killed actually. That was not only about university autonomy. When, Armenia decided very early to adopt the Bologna model, even before they became a member of the European higher education area, this was done because they wanted to assert an European identity for the country. So it was not about the structure of degrees in the university. And I can go examples. Let me mention two more and then I stop. 68, France, right? Everybody knows about that. But what is perhaps that was not about universities only. It was about political regime. It was about cultural norms. It was about so many employment, quite a lot. It was about so many other things. And you remember the president of France at that point was an extremely popular person, then popular, called Charles de Gaulle, and he didn't understand what was happening. So he called in the police, the army, and he had to resign in the end. Although he was a very popular person, he didn't understand what happened. He had to resign. And this is my second point. And this is not happening only in this part of the world. This is another example. But very often politicians don't understand when something that happens to universities, in universities, about universities, is relevant for something a lot deeper in the society. And I will mention this very directly. The prime minister of this country gave a very long interview on Sunday, Easter morning, a very long interview, which was all about CEU. There was no other subject on Easter morning than CEU. And one sentence that he said is particularly interesting. He said he didn't understand why academics from Hungary, not from CEU, speak in defense of CEU. So why are they taking side with CEU instead of defending their own university, right? Or doing something? And this is very relevant for the incapacity to understand what is happening. Because yes, everything that is happening is about academic freedom and about autonomy, but it's about something a lot deeper than that. And when you have 70,000 people taking to the street to protest, that must be about something more than just universities. And I'm not saying this is a trend or a characteristic of the entire region, but it is happening in some countries. And I am, speaking of worry or not, I'm a little uncertain about how this incapacity to understand or acknowledge what is happening will play when it comes to developing a new social compact for universities. So I'll stop here. And now the floor is open. Interventions, we used to say in this university that questions only, but I'm not in favor of that. So comments are welcome, contributions, provided they are short. So, because we need to give as many people as possible a chance to speak. So if you speak more than 2 minutes, I'm going to interrupt you. And now colleagues from the panel here can contribute as well. I see Viorel, Renata, and George already. Sorry.
I'd like to pick something about what you said last about politicians not understanding what's going on in their societies. I wonder, and this is an open question for everybody, if a specificity of Central Eastern Europe countries is that those politicians who don't understand what's going on in societies, but big time don't understand what's going on, remain in power. They don't resign. Well, Charles de Gaulle, though he was a strong political leader, he resigned when he realized that he didn't understand what was going on. Why is that happening here? I see that in Romania, I see that in Poland, I see that in Slovakia, I see that in Hungary. I don't see that in Great Britain.
Well, actually, I think the goal dissolved the National Assembly, and the results of the elections were not good, so there was that factor as well. But this is a good question. Renata?
I have a specific question to Manja, since there was no space for questions. I would be interested in your opinion, how do you deal with the situation? Okay, we need teachers who are more creative, bringing different methods of teaching this and the other, which is not present in large extent. And you said we need to incentivize, but that presumes that they know how to do it, they just are not motivated to do it. But I am afraid that it's also that they don't know how to do it because they grew up in the system. I mean, this is, like this, it's perpetuating, self-perpetuating system, so they grew up in a system which didn't teach them how to teach. So how do we cut this circle in your view? How can we approach this to change the situation, to create teachers who will teach new generation, and then this will be a better self-perpetuation? So,
Can I answer it?
Yes. It's a good question. I think that what I have seen, especially in Slovenia, is that one thing that we are largely lacking is that some solid research into teaching and learning that would be more than peanut studies that different lecturers do on their classroom on how to improve the teaching in their small specific course. We just had a conference last year in Slovenia, which was part of the wave of trying to modernize teaching and learning. And people came from across the country with tiny little case studies, how to use reflective journals in the nursing course 101, and how to improve feedback to students in engineering study course, this and that. And what we have seen is that there was lots of interest, individual interest from teachers actually to try to research how to improve teaching and learning, even on their own, without any money, within the means that they could. But those were the small parts of fragmented research, because there is actually no research funding available on the system level, which would be giving a way for a large-scale comparative studies on in this particular area. And there are no research centers that would be bringing these researchers together. So there is, I think, there is a scope in order to capacity building, where our research centers could possibly play a role as well by seeking funding for a collaborative EU-funded projects that would be dealing with these particular issues, also in the context of the Central European countries. So resources are needed. You're absolutely right. It's not that they don't want to do it. It is just that they don't know how to do it.
Thank you, Manja. Joseph?
Yes, thank you. Before making a comment to Harry's presentation, I have to tell you that I was one of the advisors in Hungary around 2003 who recommended the performance agreement, the introduction of performance agreement, but I was voted down. But to my biggest surprise, in 2007, it was introduced in a very controversial context, and it failed. And after that, about 2011, with our colleagues, we wrote a report. Why? And in one word, because everything was soft. So that was the major problem in Hungary. But back to your presentation, for me, it is, of course, I agree with the content, with the approach, but in a way it is a model. but when you are talking about a model, then you have to see at least the actors in that model, government and higher education, and it is not clear what is the nature of these actors, because these are not neutral terms, not neutral. So it means that if some country would like to apply that model, then they have to see the preconditions. So for me, as a modeling man, the most important, not the model, but the conditions, the preconditions, because simply when I would like to apply, I see the precondition, a checklist, yes, yes, no, okay, I would not introduce that. So that model, I can say that if you would like to achieve the advantages or avoid the disadvantages, then you need a checklist for that, or I can say in another formula that there is only a very homogeneous or similar group of countries who can introduce that, not 180 or 230 countries in the world. So what are those countries who can introduce that?
Yes, just.
Well, I can't answer the last question, what countries are they, but I agree entirely with what you said. Yes, the conditions are extremely, that's also one of the reasons.
And you skipped, as I can see.
That's the one I skipped. Well, they are so tough enough in terms of time. So,
It's my fault.
no, and you're absolutely right. The other one you mentioned, context is important. Of course, you should spend more attention to who the actors are and what their interests are. For instance, yesterday it was mentioned, do we talk about the Ministry of Education or about more ministries like finance, who is different from the Ministry of Education? Are they on the table as well? That makes a difference, I think. And also, or to put it in a different way, we have performance agreements now in the Netherlands and we concluded them. A lot of people agree that they have been successful and they will not be continued, which is a little bit strange, but there is a certain group of institutions who didn't like the performance agreements and their outcomes, and they have been able to change the agenda in that respect, particularly, and there's the context, and you're absolutely right. So I can't judge what happened in Hungary, and that's in 2007. But what happened in the context, the word performance has become a dirty word in the Dutch public sector, because everything is about calculation, performance. There were student protests in Amsterdam with respect to institutional leadership, but in the end it was not about institutional leadership, it was against a culture of performance. And that's why performance agreements are not continued in the Netherlands, despite the fact that they are successful. That's an answer to yes. Yeah. You have to understand the context, so I fully agree.
Just one more minor comment to this model thing. It is a very strange situation that sometimes, even if we have all the conditions which is required to introduce the model, as a result of the measurement we use and as a result of the tool we introduced, the very base of the model is destroyed. So what I mean here, it is, for example, I was in a conference last week on public management, and it was usually said that the necessary condition for public management is to trust in the state, so on and so forth. But as a result of all this contracting and other kind of thing, the whole new public management movement resulted in the deterioration of trust. So it was a condition to introduce all the thing, but how all those mechanisms work will kill the trust within different parties, and as a result, it will simply cease to exist. And now we are looking for another kind of model, like new public governance and other thing. So the conditions of the model is not permanent. It can change as a result of the model we introduce.
Thank you, Lydia.
Yes, just briefly to reply to Viorel's question, because I saw that nobody else took the baton. I think you asked why here leaders do not resign when they feel that they don't understand what's going on. I wouldn't necessarily say they don't understand it in some cases, in others maybe. I would say it's a characteristic of societies in which the distance from power, right, from the normal citizen to those perceived to be in power is very big, right? It's also about the perception of leadership. What is a good leader? If you poll that across countries, you will get very different answers. I think one thing that if you poll as a leader and your perception is to be weak instead of strong, that's a killer. That kills any political career in our part of the world. And perception of power is to not give up when you have protests, right? Is to try to go through and still keep your original idea in place, even though you realize at some point midway that maybe it wasn't the best idea in the world, but it would kill otherwise. Do you know of any political leaders in the region that stepped down because they accepted they did something wrong and then went back? I don't know many examples. We also talk about slightly divided societies. We don't have a coherent voice, right? I mean, look at the number of people watching House of Cards versus number of people watching Borgen, right? I mean, perception of how you do politics and policy is very different across society. And I am afraid that those that would signal if something is wrong is not necessarily, that the proportion of these people is not high enough to prompt an immediate change of power, as you would see in Francis de Gaulle's time. Thanks.
Yes, please.
So in Poland, 10 years ago, there was such a situation that Kaczynski, after 2 years, made earlier elections to check his situation.
There are exceptions.
And I have 2 questions to Manja and to Harry. To Manja, I can see in Poland, your observations are very common to what I can see in my country. But there are 2 large groups, one in the staff and one in the student. So students which are interested only in getting a degree, nothing more. They have no other goal in fact. They do not believe that they have any kind of knowledge or education just to get the degree to compete in the job market because it is necessary. And the staff which is interested in research and actually it is very convenient to both groups. Their needs meet together in fact. So the market incentive is, this is what everybody needs. And what to do with that? Mm-hmm. Harry, I have a question. I did not understand because you mixed funding formulas with performance agreement. And in my opinion, if you have a system funding formula, then I cannot see much room for agreements. Maybe one place that is to, because I like very much this concept of dividing universities into groups which have different missions. It is the best probably possibility. And then of course there is a place of to negotiation in which group to which group to belong. But probably it can be done by inventing some win-win mechanism. So being in a wrong group, one loses. So I hope that it is possible to invent such a mechanism that everybody belongs where he wants to believe, in a sense.
You want to start?
Yes. It's a great example that you are give it, and it's teachers are pretending that they are teaching them something, and the students are pretending that they are learning something, and then everybody is doing what they really want to do, right? Either working on the site or extracurricular activities, and teachers doing their research so they can have something to show for, and that will actually matter in their promotion, and that will actually matter maybe even in a salary incentives and the reputation of the university. It's not even in Poland. It's a similar phenomenon is discussed at Harvard as well. We have a great inflation. Students choose the courses, and it's also discussion. At the end of the day, it comes back to the question, how do we know that students learn? And I think that the only way that we can break the spell of this implicit contract that serves the interest of both groups is really to come up with the mechanisms for measuring learning. And I'm not really sure whether some kind of a standardized test is the right way to go in higher education, especially not if it would compare students across the disciplines. This is pretty much impossible. I think that more feasible way is really coming up with the quality assurance procedures at the departmental level, where they decide within the group, within the same specialty, how they will be checking student outcomes. Will it be the papers that will be read? Something has to happen there. But it's an excellent question, and it's a really big problem. And it's not that students. And if we allow it, then we allow that this category of students, just credentialists, to really. Then we lose those that could potentially be really interested academically as well. I'll finish just that, research has shown that by the disposition, when students come to the university, we usually have kind of 4 different types of students, ideally. Some are credentialists, just interested in getting their degree. Then careerists who are really focusing on getting their jobs and work towards that. Then you have a small portion of academics, those that are really academically curious and driven. And then you have those that are collegiate, interested in extracurricular pursuits. Having fun is an important part of the student experience. But it is really to find a way of measuring incomes that will tell us what is happening in the classroom. I'll stop here. There's lots to say about this. Let's go to Harry.
You want to continue this line before Harry?
One comment to that,
yeah.
If it is possible.
Yeah.
My advice always is that when we are talking about teaching and learning, then we have to keep in mind at least one example. And because we are teaching different topics here, so I suppose that the best is to think about thermodynamics, dentistry, mathematics, sociology, and architecture, for instance. Because when we are talking here, I always think that we are talking about social sciences. Social sciences is a small part of it. Don't take it seriously.
Come on.
Take more seriously all those subjects where teaching, which is at the university not teaching. So teaching is for public education, maybe. We have different words, maybe not in English, but I suppose that in English too. So what we are doing at higher education, mainly in master level, it's much more different than teaching in social science classes.
Okay, no, this wasn't meant to be against social sciences. So there's a similar intervention, and then we go to Harry, please.
Short question for Manja. How do you see the role of qualifications frameworks in promoting student-centered learning?
It's in a very short answer, the basis comes to learning outcomes, and well-defined learning outcomes should also have very well spelled out methods of achieving those particular learning outcomes. So as part of the preparation definition of learning outcomes, one can already think very carefully about the types of assignments and activities, learning activities that will be part of the teaching. If that actually happens afterwards, and how that it happens, and how do we know that it happens, it's a different story. But I think it's the foundation in the learning outcomes, and the definition of learning outcomes, which come with the qualification frameworks, are the fundamental principle as well of teaching and learning. I mean, those concepts speak to each other very, very, very closely.
Thank you, Harry.
I can't answer your question very, very briefly, but I'll try and make it very, very brief. So in terms of performance-based funding and performance agreements and how to mingle them, it's very complex. What I think is crucial in understanding that in terms of performance, you can do the funding ex ante up front, or you can do it ex post. Most of the time we do it ex post, right? First you perform, then you get the money. What the Dutch did in terms of the performance agreements, they said you can have the money first, we make the agreements, if you don't reach your targets, you will have less money in the next round. So they pay upfront, ex post. And that's why, so they took, of the overall budget, they took 7% of the overall budget they reserved for this part of performances. Then they talked to all, and they said, okay, these 7% you can have. And then they started to negotiate with all the institutions, and the institutions then could say, on certain topics, our ambition is to develop a center of expertise to improve our research. Or we want to use the dropout rate that is 40% now, we will reduce to 20%. If they would perceive such a target, after 3 years they would say, okay, you had the money, you can keep the money, you will have the same amount for the next period. If you didn't deliver what you have promised, we will cut you in the next round. So that's one way of having agreements and funding.
So a kind of grant,
Yes.
Okay, I was about to say that we stop here, but please, last time, yes. I was very proud to be able to finish on time, but we can still do it. We can still do it. Please go ahead. Please go
Can I
ahead.
just make an observation? Because I've had the unique pleasure of being to conferences on all continents of the world, except, in fact, for Africa, since the beginning of the year. And I see something here in the very rhetoric being used which reflects a big challenge our world has. And that is between what is, in fact, done on a basis, evidence-based argument, and it's based on a series of cases, what is done in terms of faith-based assertion, and what is done in terms of emotional manipulation and intuition. We obviously have a leader of the world who doesn't seem to have much of an idea about evidence-based case-making and a rational area, but is using very much areas of assertion of faith, sometimes different faiths every day, and then also big issues of emotional manipulation, particularly fear. Why I mention it is that I think universities and academics are singularly failing at the moment in learning what to do about the assertion of causes. Most political argument is ultimately relying on the assertion of a cause, where nationalism or capitalism or the assertion of some faith. And that issue, to pigeonhole what may be an evidence-based conclusion, is just another opinion asserting someone else's underlying axioms. And with that, the assertion of a faith is something we're not dealing with well. And that leaves us all very vulnerable to be misrepresented in presses that sell papers or digital space in terms of the way in which they, in fact, argue causes, not very effectively arguing cases. So I just observe that and say, I heard here, I was noting down words, particularly verbs people were using all the time, because they're showing a confusion in our dialogue yesterday and today between case and cause, and sometimes getting into the emotional area. How do we play with issues of pride and faith, for instance, or fear, but in ways that are fully justifiable in our university context? So I think it's a real challenge. We see it in the United States hugely, and the growing exodus of academics trying to get out of the United States.
Well, let me try to offer some thoughts which continue in a way what Malcolm is saying, and I'm doing this by some kind of a sloppy personal concluding of this session. In my understanding, we are talking about three things, and one is teaching and learning. How do we conceptualize, how do we understand teaching in this part of the world and in other parts of the world in order to make it, I don't know exactly what, better, relevant, and so on. I think what is interesting, and you will not have time to contradict me now, but you contradict me later on that. What is interesting is that the issues of teaching, curriculum, pedagogy become issues of public policy. So it's not only a matter of pedagogy, how the teacher understands, but it's something that goes beyond just the classroom, and it has a public policy relevance. The other topic is reforms. How do we understand reforms in higher education? How do we study them? How do we explain them? What works, what doesn't work, how it works. And I can say this also, it's kind of becoming an issue of public policy, beyond being just simply higher education policy or techniques of reforms. And there is perhaps another dimension which is about things that go beyond universities but are important for universities. My little comment at the beginning, an example, was not about I didn't intend it to lead to a question on whether politicians one prime minister or another prime minister or president should resign or not. That was not my point. My point was that there is something about universities that goes deeper, goes beyond universities themselves, and it goes in terms of solving these issues. They go beyond higher education reform as well, and because these are issues that are of larger societal relevance, those actors who address them are also very different. Sometimes the army is solving the issue. We know, unfortunately, such cases. Some other times the government, the parliament, or the constitutional court in a democratic country. I could have mentioned the example of it's just an example. The issues of I shouldn't say positive discrimination. Affirmative action had to be taken all the way up to the constitutional court in the United States. And that was not only about universities; it was about something a lot deeper. So I don't think we really have a theory, or there's much research about how, when such occasions, because this is not every day that such issues emerge, when universities are a revelator for something more broadly important in the society, but they do happen, and we don't have a theory about how this happens, how universities should react, how others should react, and we hesitate, for example, in our own context, where is the limit between academic and political? Where is the limit between higher education policy and politics? And I got emails today from my colleagues saying, should I answer this, what someone said today, visiting a high school? And I said, no, you cannot say it, because it's not based on your research, right? This is a political issue, and therefore, if you want to be a politician, you want to speak as not an academic or not someone from the university, do it, but otherwise don't do it, because it doesn't. Am I sure that I was right? I'm not. But this illustrates this hesitation when we are at a blurred border between university and the society, and what is important there. I am very glad you have no time to contradict me. But the good news is that you will have time for lunch, and you can have your coffee, and we can continue this discussion in the afternoon next year also.